Who fears to speak of 98, who blushes at the name, when cowards mock the patriot's fate, who hangs their head for shame? He's all a knave or half a slave, who slights his country thus. But a true man, like you, man, will fill your glass with us. We drink the memory of the brave, the faithful and the few. Some lie far off beyond the wave, some sleep in Ireland too. They rose in dark and evil days to right their native land. They kindled here a living blaze that nothing shall withstand. Alas, that might can vanquish right. They fell and passed away. But true men, like you men, are plenty here today. That poem is called The Memory of the Dead, but it's known better by its first line, who fears to speak of 98. And it was written in 1843 and published in the Nation newspaper. And it was published when Daniel O'Connell was at the height of his repeal movement and trying to restore the Irish Parliament. And it was seen as an expression of support for the memory of 1798. It was also actually directed against O'Connell. He was seen as one of those men who feared to speak of 98. He was seen as the knave who blushes at the name. He was seen as the coward who mocked the patriot's fate back and then, which also shows how disputed the memory of the 1798 rebellion was. John Kells Ingram was actually a Trinity student when he wrote that piece. He later ended up becoming a very conservative vice provost of Trinity and turned his back on his earlier radicalism, as so many people seem to do. They seem to be much more radical in their younger days. But the memory of 1798 would exert an enormous influence over Irish history for the next 100 and 150 years. There are very many reasons for why it failed. There hadn't been a unified campaign on the rebel side. The government had been very successful in sealing off the counties. The rebel troops lacked discipline. They lacked leadership. The arrests had disrupted their strategy. They lacked the weaponry that the British had. I think it was a major mistake not taking Dublin and not using that as kind of a base of operations. The counties did not act in unison. We see that they all acted at different times of the summer. And that allowed them, the British government, to deal with each part separately and then move on to the next one. I think it's also significant that Catholic Ireland, by and large, sided with the government. There wasn't the large-scale uprising that Wolfe Tone had predicted. Perhaps there wasn't the one that he had said would have happened in 1796, and maybe that was because of the brutality of the repressive policies. I mentioned that there had been some Catholic leaders. Well, and Catholics were excommunicated for being involved in the rebellion. But out of 1,800 priests in the county of Wexford in 1798, only 70 priests sided with the rebels, and they were described by the Bishop of Ferns as the very feces of the church. So in years to come, the role of the Catholic Church in the rebellion was much disputed. By those who were sympathetic to the Catholic Church, well, they emphasised that role because they like to say, look, Catholic Ireland backed you, the Catholic priests and bishops backed you in 1798. For those who were anti-clerical on the nationalist side, they downplayed the role of the church because they didn't want to make it appear that priests were involved in the leadership of it. So in a way, it became very contested ground in the years ahead for it. But certainly the bloodshed, the blood that had been spilt by the 1798 rebellion had huge repercussions for Ireland in the decades ahead. It also had a major impact on the thinking of the British government, because they had always been a bit unsure about legislative independence in 1782. They didn't really know what was going on in Ireland with this period of parliamentary independence led by Henry Grattan. Because even though they were still able to legislate in many areas as before, there were times when the Irish Parliament tried to go its own way. For example, in 1788 and 89, when the King went mad during the Regency crisis. The 1793 Relief Act was a time when the British Parliament had to pretty much force that through against the wishes of the Irish Protestant loyalists. And we have to remember that this Parliament from 1782 to 1800 wasn't really Grattan's Parliament, this nice, liberal, shining moment in Irish history when it was all nice and friendly to the Catholics and keen to pass legislation to unite the country. It was a repressive administration. It believed that the best thing about having an Irish Parliament that had power is that it could use that power against the Catholics. And the British government didn't mind that so much as long as it governed effectively. But what did the 1790s show? The 1790s show that it had failed at protecting itself. Because in 1796, the French had almost landed at Bantry Bay. And then what happened in 1798? The country erupted into rebellion. And why? Partly because the loyalists had been so vicious in the policies that they had pursued in 1797 and the first part of 1798. So what did that show to the British? It showed them that having an Irish Parliament was a liability, that it did nothing for getting Catholic Ireland on side, and it did nothing for keeping Protestant loyalists secure. So what was the point of it? And that's why immediately upon the outbreak of the 1798 rebellion, they decided to abolish the Irish Parliament. William Pitt was the Prime Minister of Britain in this time. He had become Prime Minister in December 1783 at the extraordinarily young age of 24. It's incredible to think that now. Someone becoming Prime Minister of a country at the age of 24. But he had become Prime Minister because he was exceptional. He was a brilliant orator. He was brilliant on economics. He was a statesman. And he had all of that power even as a young man. So he became Prime Minister in 1783. He continued all the way up throughout the 1790s. And he received news of the outbreak of the rebellion on the 28th of May. And he wrote straight back to Ireland, can we bring in an act to appoint commissioners to bring in a union? In other words, let's abolish the Irish Parliament and rule directly from London. Instead of having 300 MPs in Dublin, who seem to be botching the job, let's send 100 MPs, or whatever number we decide on, over to England, to Westminster, and then we look after Irish affairs alongside Welsh and Scottish affairs and English affairs and wider imperial affairs. And this was actually a very difficult time in Pitt's own life. He had fought a duel the day before, on Sunday the 27th of May, over an incident that had happened in the House of Commons. They were passing legislation to support the Navy. They were passing funding for the Navy. And George Tierney, an Irish-born MP who caused Pitt an awful lot of trouble, tried to block this, block the funds going to the Navy. And Pitt accused him of obstructing the defence of the country. And Tierney was furious and challenged him to a duel afterwards. You know, how could you accuse an MP of obstructing the defence of the country? That's effectively calling him a traitor. And so they met to fight a duel over something that had been said in the House of Commons. They exchanged pistol fire, and neither man hit, neither man was injured. But it did horrify public opinion in England. The fact that, think of it, the Prime Minister of Britain fighting a duel. The King, George III, was horrified, and especially because they'd done it on a Sunday. But Pitt refused to back down, refused to apologise, and threatened to resign if much was made of it. So Pitt was in a difficult point in his own career, especially because the war with France was not going well. And the war was to become the huge dynamic. And what was Ireland and the outbreak of a rebellion showing? But that Ireland would always be the weak spot. And they needed Ireland. They needed Ireland because they needed Irish Catholic troops. They also needed Ireland because they couldn't allow the French to gain a foothold in Ireland. They had to secure the support of the Irish. And no, not the Irish. The Irish Catholics. They already had the support of the Irish Protestants. Now they needed to gain the support of the Irish Catholics. So how do you do that? And Pitt realised the only way you could do it was by granting Catholic emancipation. And what Catholic emancipation meant was that you would give Catholics full political rights. Since 1793, Catholics had the right to vote, but they couldn't sit in Parliament. So this would give them the right to sit in Parliament. It would allow them to become King's Councils, reach the higher levels in the law, become judges, basically open up all the professions that had been closed off to Catholics. Now, the danger with granting that to an Irish Parliament is that there was a danger that eventually the 300 MPs would end up including a majority of Catholics. And then there was no guarantee that they wouldn't try to overturn the land settlement, get the land back off these Protestant landlords and distribute it among the Catholic people. There was also no guarantee that they wouldn't try and just separate from Britain and declare independence. That didn't seem very safe. So the argument was that you would abolish the Irish Parliament, rule from England, but actually it didn't matter if the 100 Irish MPs were Catholic or Protestant, because they would only be a minority of the 600 and something MPs in Westminster. It was a safe way of giving Catholics full rights. So in a way, the Act of Union was conceived as a reaction against the 1798 rebellion. It was seen as a way of saying the 1798 rebellion has exposed the failure of Grattan and his strategy. It has exposed the danger of Wolfe Tone and his strategy. It has exposed the danger of Fitzgibbon, Lord Clare, the Irish Lord Chancellor, who believed that the only policy should be to treat the Catholics as animals, as savages, as people who couldn't be trusted. All throughout the 1790s, Lord Clare was saying, the only problem with the Catholics is you give them too much. Don't give them the vote. Don't give them any power. Treat them as if they are dangerous. Guard them. Terrorise them. Keep them down. So Pitt realised that had failed because they had risen up anyway. Grattan's policy had failed. Tone's was too dangerous to consider. Let's try a new way. And a union was something that he'd been thinking about for a number of years. He'd been thinking about it going back to 1783 when he became Prime Minister. But the time was not right. And that's why, as soon as he heard about the outbreak of the rebellion, he decided to plan for a union. And that's why the person he sent over to crush the rebellion was Charles Cornwallis, because that was the person he had trusted. He had wanted him to come to Ireland before, in 1784. Cornwallis had refused. He had asked Cornwallis to come over in 1797, and Cornwallis gave him an ultimatum. He said, I will only come over if you give rights to the Catholics. And Pitt couldn't grant that. The fact that Cornwallis was prepared to accept that in 1798 showed that something had changed. And that something was that Pitt was now prepared to give the Catholics full rights. Pitt was now prepared to do that once it was accompanied by a union. And that was why Cornwallis was sent over to crush the rebellion, which he did brilliantly and effectively, destroying the rebels at Balnamuck. But also, he was sent there to then make sure that the violence, the terror, the brutality, the oppression, the rapes, all of that was put to an end. That British rule and order was restored in Ireland, because now the government would work to reconcile the Irish Catholics. So the story of the Act of Union that we'll be looking at next week isn't a really simple story of the Irish Parliament being a great thing worth defending and the British being evil and insidious in trying to remove it. It was actually more complicated than that, because the British had a good motivation behind it. They wanted to give the Catholics full rights. But the reason why the Union was so emotive, and why it became so emotive in years to come, was because it was something meaningful to the Irish people. The idea of having your own parliament, your own representatives, being able to meet and debate the issues in Dublin. Not send them to London where they'll be drowned out by the waves of British MPs. That is why Daniel O'Connell opposed the Union and spent the rest of his life trying to repeal it and restore the Irish Parliament. Why Charles Stewart Parnell tried to have an Irish Parliament with Home Rule. Why the Irish revolutionary leaders in the 20th century, Pearse and Collins and De Valera, fought in 1916 to restore not just an Irish Parliament, but to go further and have an Irish Republic. Tone's vision of complete separation and independence. Because the Union was seen as a loss of national self-confidence. And it was an insult to the pride. It was a national humiliation. It was something that eroded centuries of Irish respect. It eroded the victory that had been won by Henry Grattan in 1782. And that is why the debates over the Union in 1798 and 1800 produced some of the finest oratory in Irish history. It led to the return of Henry Grattan to the Irish Parliament in his red volunteer uniform to speak, to fight for that Irish Parliament that he had done so much to create. And it's why 1798 and 1800, in the aftermath of the rebellion, those years, 99 and 1800, became some of the most charged and heated years in the history of Irish politics.